Okay, so we are right at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I do have a little bit of a brief introduction here, so that I'll give a couple more minutes for others to filter in if they're trying to do so before our actual presentation starts. So I just want to say good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Andrew Jackson and the Transfer of Florida in 1821 with Doctors James Cusick and Sherry Johnson. I'm Katie Kelly, and I'm the Special Programs Coordinator at the Orange County Regional History Center. Our organization is located in downtown Orlando, and we offer 3 floors of permanent exhibitions, renowned special exhibitions from the Smithsonian, and a variety of interactive and unique experiences and programs for guests of all ages. While the History Center is partially funded by Orange County, donations to the Historical Society of Central Florida are vitally important to the center's ability to serve the community and continue to fulfill our mission to serve as the to fulfill our mission to serve as the gateway for community engagement, education, and inspiration by preserving and sharing Central Florida's continually unfolding story. Donations allow for the care and upkeep of the historic collections, presentation of special exhibitions, and offering innovative programming. I'm going to put a link in the chat for anyone who is interested in supporting the museum and the Historical Society. There's a variety of ways that you can do that through purchasing memberships, donations, volunteering, lots of things you can do to help support us. Today's program is being facilitated as a webinar, so that means that attendees do not have access to your video or your audio. We will save some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to put any questions that you have for Sherry and James in the chat as they come up, and we will address those at the end. This program is the 6th and final installment of our Joseph L. Brechner Speaker Series for this spring. This year, our series theme is Becoming Florida, as we mark the bicentennial of Florida becoming a U.S. territory in 1821. So today we'll be rounding out the series with a discussion of Andrew Jackson and Florida's territorial period. So without any further ado, I am happy to introduce today's presenters. James Cusick is the curator for the P.K. Yonge Library in Florida, of Florida history at the University of Florida. He writes primarily about life in Florida during the late colonial period and is the author of The Other War of 1812, the Patriot War, and the American Invasion of Spanish East Florida. Sherry Johnson is a retired professor from of the history of Florida International University in Miami. Dr. Johnson is the author of Social Transformation of 18th Century Cuba and Climate and Catastrophe in Cuba and the Atlantic World in the Age of Revolution, which is the winner of the 2012 Gordon K. and Sybil Lewis Prize for Best Book on Caribbean Studies. In addition to their individual works, together Drs. Cusick and Johnson have co-authored Andrew Jackson in Florida from 2016 and The Voyages of Ponce de León, Scholarly Perspectives 1513 to 2013 in 2012. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn off my camera and microphone. Drs. Cusick and Johnson, please feel free to take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much. We want to thank you sincerely, Katie, for this invitation. We want to thank you, the Orange County Regional History Center, and especially the Joseph L. Brechner Speaker Series. Did I pronounce that correctly? Anyway, the title of our presentation is Andrew Jackson and the Transfer of Florida in 1821, the year Florida became a part of the United States. The reason why we're here is to commemorate the transfer of Florida from Spanish to American sovereignty. 200 years ago yesterday, St. Augustine and East Florida became part of the U.S. And for Pensacola, that anniversary will take place on next Saturday, July 17th. We were invited to speak about a book on Jackson, who became the first American governor of the territory. But Jackson never came to St. Augustine. He was only in Pensacola a little over 5 months, and he and his wife Rachel hated every minute that they were there. So we decided to move beyond him and speak on how he became an influence that had lasting repercussions for Florida's future. We do have a disclaimer. This is not great man history. Both in the book and in this presentation, we hope to offer insights on how Jackson's actions impacted individuals and also impacted communities who are less studied and therefore are less visible in the historical record. So we start with the thesis of our book. Jackson's time in Florida, which was barely a year in total, provided a template for how Florida would develop. His military actions in 1814 and 1818, along with his time as governor in 1821, convinced him that the United States had to control both Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, and that Native Americans had to submit to U.S. authority. Understanding his time in Florida is crucial to understanding Jackson's legacy and the consequences, not just for the territory of Florida, but for the nation as a whole. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We hope our study will complement work that's already done. For example, studies about the plantation economy by Ed Baptist, studies of African-American life after the transfer by Irv Winsborough and Frank Moratti, on Moses Levy and early Jewish settlement by Chris Monaco, on the Rogues and Other Rascals who came to Florida by Mike Denham, and on the Second Seminole War by the pioneer John Mann, John and Mary Lou Missel, and Chris Monaco. We chose to focus the book on how, the talk, on how Jackson and other American officials tried, and sometimes not very successfully, to secure the new southern border of the United States. Major policy issues were dealing with the Native Americans, interdicting the illegal slave trade, and eliminating attacks by Caribbean pirates. Yet, we present two very different eyewitness perspectives about the transfer of Florida from Spain to the US in July 1821 and the subsequent American rule. To do this, we will present vignettes taken from a journal kept by a young U.S. Navy Lieutenant, James Freeman Curtis. Jim will discuss the perspective of one of the most influential leaders of the Miccosukee Nation, the leader Nehemiah. And now I'll turn the screen over to Jim, who will talk about highlights in Andrew Jackson's life.
Yes, hello. I'd also like to thank the History Center and thank Katie for inviting us to this talk. Just to give you a little bit of background on Jackson. Jackson is usually associated with Tennessee, although he was actually born in South Carolina. He came to national prominence during the War of 1812, primarily for his defeat of a major British invasion in New Orleans, which prevented the British from capitalizing on a victory along the Mississippi River and seizing American territory. And shortly after that victory, which was in 1815, he was already being talked about as a potential candidate for the presidency. But what we want to focus on here is his relationship to Florida. And he basically came to Florida 3 times. He came briefly during the War of 1812, when he brought an American force into Spanish West Florida to expel a British force that was stationed in Pensacola. And shortly after that is when he left to go and defend New Orleans. Then he was back in Florida in 1818 to prosecute what became known as the First Seminole War, which took place mostly in the Big Bend area around the Apalachicola River and between there and the Suwannee River. And he also went to Pensacola again, a second time then, and captured Pensacola a second time. And that time attempted to turn it over to the United States, but the United States government essentially returned Pensacola to Spain. And then his third time, which is what we're talking about today, is when he was appointed our first governor. Came essentially as a military governor, and he was already in the state in late May, not state, our state now, but he was already in Florida in late May and June. He didn't officially become governor until the change of flags in Pensacola, which was on July 17th. Next Saturday is the anniversary for that in 1821. And then he remained governor through until early October, at which point he resigned. But even though his tenure was very brief, we hope to show that both what he was doing and what the United States in general was doing in terms of pursuing this transfer were very influential and had a big impact on the development of Florida, first as a territory and then as a state.
Hey, Dr. Cusick, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think what we're seeing as the audience is the is not your presentation screen. It's the other screen.
Oh, you know, it does say up top that your screen sharing is paused. All right, hold on. I think we're going to have to stop the share and then maybe try and redo it. Let's see. Did it appear now?
Yep. Okay, we're good now. I see the right presentation screen now. Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks for warning us about that. And sorry about that, although mostly what you missed so far was slides with text on them. So you didn't really miss that much. But we're going to pick up here.
We missed our two eyewitnesses, so I'm just going to go back if it's okay.
Good point.
Uh-oh. What's happened here?
Well, let's try it on the screen.
I tried that. Okay. All right. So thank you. Okay. Here are our two eyewitnesses, the only really important slide that we missed. The two gentlemen, the reason we chose these two gentlemen, James Freeman Curtis and Nehemiah, is because as we're talking about Jackson and Jackson's governorship of Pensacola, both of these men, very important men, even though they're totally unknown pretty much, had interactions with Jackson and Jackson's governorship in Pensacola. And that, of course, had consequences for Florida later on. So this is the only slide that we actually missed of all of them, of the ones that we did. So, okay. So there we have the rundown of Jackson's life. Okay. Katie, can you see this one?
Yes, I can. We're good to go now.
Okay, very good. Super. So moving right along. What happened in Florida? The transfer of Florida occurred because of the collapse of the Spanish Empire in the Greater Caribbean. This collapse began in 1808 with Napoleon invading the Iberian Peninsula, but there were a lot of things going on that led to the transfer from 1819 to 1821 with the Patriot War here that Jim has written about in his book, The Other War. Jackson was always ready from Tennessee to assemble a militia and invade. There were Baratarian pirates in New Orleans. There were filibusters in the Rio Grande Valley. There were full-scale revolts in Mexico. There was insurgent activity all along the northern coast of Colombia, many of whom contributed to the pirate problem later on. And then Bolivar had received asylum in Haiti in 1815, and he also contributed to the problems of Spain and the Spanish Empire. With Jackson's last invasion in 1818, in which, as Jim mentioned, he captured Pensacola and evicted the Spanish officials, negotiations began in earnest to sell the province to the United States. The negotiations began in 1819, and by 1821, the treaty was finally ratified in February. And as we've mentioned, the transfer began July 10th and July 17th. Okay, the acquisition of Florida presented several challenges to the newest government, not the least of which was defending its new borders. Florida's long coastline offered innumerable opportunities for smugglers and pirates who operated freely in the waters between the peninsula and Cuba. The U.S. Navy had several large warships, but they were too big to pursue the pirates into their safe havens or overtake smugglers' fast ships. The solution was to create a fleet of smaller ships, and in the late 18-teens, Congress authorized the Navy to begin a program of shipbuilding. It commissioned 4 shallow draft speedy schooners, try saying that 3 times real fast, to be able to catch slave ships and chase the pirates into the bays of Florida and Cuba. In 1820, work began in 4 Navy yards up and down the East Coast, and the 4 initial ships were christened with whimsical nautical names: the Shark, the Dolphin, the Alligator, and the ship that's the center of our story, the Porpoise. The Porpoise was built in the Portsmouth Navy Yard in New Hampshire. The man named as its captain was Master Commandant James Ramage, who was born in Ireland, but who was invariably described as being both, quote, hard-nosed and hot-tempered. He and his crew were sent to sea with two mandates: to interdict the illegal slave trade and to eliminate pirate attacks on American shipping. And we know about the Porpoise's exploits from a journal kept by one of the three lieutenants, the man I mentioned, James Freeman Curtis. Okay, James Freeman Curtis was a Bostonian, was born in 1797 to a mercantile family. He served with distinction in the War of 1812. He later served in Algeria with Stephen Decatur, fighting pirates. At the end of the War of 1812, he was furloughed for 18 months, but brought back as a lieutenant, sent to one of the larger warships, the Independence. And when this fleet was being created, he was detached from the Independence and sent to Portsmouth, to join the maiden voyage of the crew of the Porpoise in 1821. Curtis was a Bostonian, and he came with all of the prejudices and preconceived notions of his time. Certainly, for the most part, he had nothing ever good to say about the places he visited or the people he encountered. But thanks to his meticulous impressions of what he saw in Florida, we have at least one eyewitness account of the first year of the territory. Okay, the Porpoise left Portsmouth on May 8, 1821 on her maiden voyage and sailing southward. Her specific orders were to participate in the evacuation of the Spanish governor and garrison from St. Augustine after the transfer of sovereignty. She sailed well, but early in the voyage, she lost her mainmast. So she put into Charleston, South Carolina for repairs. She arrived in St. Augustine on June 4th, but Ramage found out that the Spaniards were not ready to evacuate. So the Porpoise returned briefly to American territory to St. Mary's, Georgia. From there, she left to cruise the waters off the Florida Peninsula, fulfilling the other part of her mandate to interdict slave vessels. She came back to St. Augustine on June 30th, found that the transfer would indeed take place in the near future, and so the crew began loading the ordnance, the cargo, and the effects of the people who would sail on board to Havana. Surprisingly, Curtis did not record the ceremony, but he did comment on St. Augustine, and I'm quoting, "This town is at present in a dilapidated state, but the ruins denote considerable magnificence in times of yore. The inhabitants, that is the Spaniards, appeared friendly to us. Every house contains a shop. How they subsist, though, I cannot conceive." So I'm going to go back. On Monday, July 16th, the Porpoise, leading a convoy of 11 ships, got underway from St. Augustine. Captain Ramage had invited Jose Coppinger, the governor of East Florida, his son, and Jose Maria Arredondo, one of the sons of the famous Florida Arredondo family, to take passage with him to Cuba. Curtis found them, quote, very excellent men, and they were of great use to him in learning Spanish. The trip, which normally took no more than 9 days, took nearly 2 weeks, mostly because of bad weather, but also because of problems with the other ships in the convoy. They arrived in Havana on August 4th and stayed there as short a time as possible. It was the height of summer, and the crew were always in danger of coming down with a variety of deadly diseases, such as malaria, dengue, and yellow fever. They left Havana on August 10th, heading towards New Orleans, but they had to change their destination for Pensacola because a fever appeared on board the 4th day after leaving port. 2 days later, they recognized that it was the dreaded yellow fever, or black vomit, named because the victim vomited up blood which was black. And they realized that they had to make port quickly. So instead of sailing to New Orleans, they diverted to Pensacola, where Jackson had taken command as military governor barely a month earlier on July 17th. Once in Pensacola, the captain and crew could hardly avoid coming in contact with the governor. Curtis specifically had 4 direct interactions with him, possibly more, and the most important of which was the governor's reaction to the emergency aboard the Porpoise. Again, I'm paraphrasing Curtis. Good heavens, where did... So Curtis talks about how the governor, when they arrived in Pensacola, the governors brought the people on shore that were ill. He had sent a letter to General Jackson talking about, mentioning that the crew had been sick, but down came the master of the town and ordered them back on board. Curtis mentions that Ramage wrote to Jackson saying that they had been chased out of town and Jackson came to the crew's aid, allowing them to stay on town, countermanding the orders of the town council. Whoops. Curtis also had other interactions with Jackson. On September 5th, he dined with the general and Mrs. Jackson, and he wrote that Jackson was a very fine person. He had a different opinion of Mrs. Jackson, and he wrote that she was really not very cultured, and actually he distinctly called her vulgar. He had a second interaction with Jackson and Mrs. Jackson when they were allowed to take a voyage up the bay about 10 miles, in which the general and Mrs. Jackson went to see the brick furnaces on the other side of the bay. So over the course of a month, Curtis and the captain and crew had ample time to get to know the provisional governor and form an opinion. For his part, Curtis was a thorough Bostonian. He had arrived in Pensacola prepared not to like Andrew Jackson, and I believe he came away from the encounter with a changed opinion. I believe that he might have been negative toward him, but at the very least, he came away with an opinion of reasonableness. And I believe this happened because of the first impressions are the best. Jackson's championship of the Porpoise's crew when they were threatened by the town official was key. It's clear that Curtis ascribed to, or at least believed the national gossip that Rachel Jackson was common. But he left the town with a grudging admiration for Andrew Jackson that were not shared by many Bostonians at the time. As we mentioned earlier, Jackson's invasion of Florida in 1818 caused a huge national stir, and the instigators or the primary opponents of Jackson were the politicians in the Northeast. And I believe this because in the month that they were in Pensacola, Curtis never wrote one single negative word about Andrew Jackson. In other instances throughout the journal, of which I've only presented a part, Curtis severely criticized people, up to and including calling the wife of the governor of Matanzas, Cuba, a hyena. And he was critical of Rachel, but if he disapproved of Andrew Jackson, he never put down these thoughts in his private journal. In addition, the captain of the Porpoise, James Ramage, became a zealous supporter. In later years, he was unwavering in his support of Jacksonian politics and was a close confidant of Jackson's protege, Richard Keith Call. So much so that in 1825, Ramage served as second in a duel in which Call participated, and both of the men survived. So to wrap up my part, these two examples are part of the Jacksonian puzzle. Jackson was and remains an enigma. With some people, certain people, Jackson was a paradigm of gallantry and honor, and that type of behavior probably resonated with Lieutenant Curtis and Captain Ramage. But there is another side of the story of people who interacted with Jackson and had a far less complimentary opinion. Curtis witnessed that also on Thursday, September 20th, in which General Jackson visited a schooner accompanied by two Indian chiefs of the Seminole Nation who had come to treat for peace. The leader of these chiefs was our other eyewitness about whom Jim will now speak, Nehemiah.
All right, thank you. And so let me just say that, with Curtis, you've seen an example of how quickly the United States and United States forces moved to exert American authority in Florida. It happened, very, very soon after the transfer. And you also see kind of the magnetic or the charisma of Andrew Jackson who could really get people to side with him and to support him. But I'm going to talk now a little bit about a rather different encounter that he had with Nehemiah, who was a chief among the Miccosukee Indians. Now, many people probably, when you think of the Seminole, the Miccosukee, the Creek, and you think of this time period, the first name that comes to mind is probably Osceola for his leadership in the Second Seminole War. But at the time that we're talking about, Nehemiah was really among the primary leaders of the Miccosukee and Creek in Florida. And he had had many prior encounters with Andrew Jackson, and all of them were ones in which he was in conflict with Andrew Jackson. He was counted among the Red Stick Creeks, who Jackson was fighting in 1813 and 1814 during the Creek War. And Nehemiah's town, Foul Town, which was up on the Flint Apalachicola watershed, was one of the first towns to be attacked during the First Seminole War in 1818. And so Nehemiah very much knew Jackson the way other Native American people knew him, as Sharp Knife. That was their nickname for him, in part because in victory, Jackson tended to exact very harsh terms or very harsh conditions upon defeated Native Americans. The Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814 divested the Creeks and their allies of millions of land, of acres of land. So understandably, Nehemiah and others that went with him, like John Blunt and Mulatto King, other leaders of the Miccosukee and Creek, went to Pensacola very apprehensively. They wanted to know what was going to be in store for them and their people as the United States took over control of Florida. And I have to say that what Miccosukee, or what Nehemiah heard in Pensacola was not favorable. Jackson made it clear that he thought at some point the Native groups would be consolidated into one area of Florida, and there was already talk of moving them westward. So Nehemiah came away from that talk realizing that for his people and for allied people among the Creek and Seminole, this change in government could have very severe consequences. Now, no sooner really had he gotten a home, and at that point his new territory was around what today's we would know as Tallahassee, then he had two American delegates show up at his door, sent by the territorial government. Now, this was slightly after Jackson had left Florida as governor, but still very early on in the territorial period. Dr. William Simmons and John Lee Williams had been sent to scout the location of a new capital for the territory of Florida. It was no longer, the capital would no longer be at St. Augustine or Pensacola. They were going to choose a middle ground and a new town. And so they appeared at Nehemiah's doorstep to negotiate with him, to ask him if he would cede a portion of his lands to become the new territorial capital. Which I have to say Nehemiah actually acceded to. But again, this was further writing on the wall for people like Nehemiah, that their situation and their rights to their lands in Florida might be very much under threat. If we move along 2 further years, Nehemiah was by that time dealing with Jackson's successor, William Pope Duval, and became one of the signatories of the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. He was a reluctant signatory, but under this agreement, the United States decided that it would set aside in Florida a reservation for Creek Seminoles and Miccosukees, and also promised them various types of support in the form of implements for agriculture, annual food allowances, and some subsidies. But you see in this map from 1831 where that reservation was scheduled to be. And one thing you should probably notice about it is it was in the central part of the state, and it did not touch water. It did not touch the oceans on any side. So all Native American peoples were to reside within this reservation, and they would have no communication with any coastline, which meant they couldn't trade openly with anyone, with other powers, or with general merchants. They had no place to ship goods that, or engage in things like the pelt trade that they had engaged in before. And very soon it became apparent that this territory was not going to be large enough to support all the people. And also the promises of foodstuffs and other supplies was usually heavily delayed and often didn't arrive at all. So this reservation system did not work for anyone, basically. The Native peoples couldn't really survive on the grounds of this reservation, and people moving into the states, white settlers moving into the states, actually wanted to move into those lands and were constantly kind of infiltrating those lands or trespassing on them. Oops, I'm going to stay with this slide for a minute. So the end of the story is that Nehemiah, although he had tried to be accommodating to this new kind of American regime that took place in Florida, by the 1830s had pretty much become fed up with any agreement with the U.S. government and with the lack of fulfillment of various promises that had been made in earlier treaties. And he actually relocates to Alabama, where in the 1830s he leads Creeks in a revolt against being removed westward. They're defeated. He's defeated along with them, and ultimately ends up going with 1,600 other people into exile in Indian Territory. This revolt is taking place roughly at the same time as the Second Seminole War in Florida, which even to date is one of the longest Indian wars in history, went on for 7 years. And although many groups of Seminoles ultimately were forced westward, as we know, today's Miccosukee and Seminole tribes are the descendants of people who ultimately refused to leave Florida and won a homeland for themselves in the south of Florida. All right, I want to mention one other thing that happened in 1821 while Jackson was governor. It wasn't really instigated by Jackson, but it was instigated by a force of Native Americans who had traditionally fought with him. In addition to fighting against Native Americans, he also, on many occasions, had Native American allies. And this is the story of Angola, which existed down on the Braden and Manatee rivers on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And that was one of the largest communities of runaway slaves and maroon communities in Florida at that time. There were between 600 and 700 people living there. They were trading with people who put in around Tampa Bay or around those rivers. And in 1821, a group of Native American allies, largely Native American allies of the U.S. Army and of Andrew Jackson, went down to that area, attacked the community, and essentially eliminated it. I mean, either captured the people who were there or drove them off or took them to be sold back into slavery. This is a second aspect of what's happening in Florida around the time that it becomes an American territory. Now, the picture you're showing, that you're seeing here, is not actually Florida. This is actually an image from Virginia, from the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia in 1831. But interestingly enough, everything you see in that print was later reused in Florida as a depiction of the Second Seminole War. But what's happening here is that, Florida in 1821 is really becoming integrated into the American Deep South, into the slave South. And two of the things that are coming along with that is that Native American groups are no longer going to have sovereignty or land rights in these territories, and they're going to be pushed by treaty or other means to move further west. And the second aspect of this changeover is that, Deep South slave economy, slave plantation economy, the slave owners or the plantation owners are not going to tolerate groups of free blacks or maroon blacks, particularly not free blacks who are congregated in large numbers and who, have the capability of defending themselves or of using weaponry, they're not going to allow groups like that to exist. And that's one reason why Angola was targeted very early on as a place that had to be subdued and eliminated. So these are two consequences of the changeover to Florida that had, very harsh overtones and very harsh results for people who were already living in Florida at the time of the transfer. Right, just to wrap up on Jackson's governorship, we mentioned he served a very short time, less than 5 months total in Florida. He actually had a co-governor or secretary, Robert Butler, who was responsible for what was happening in St. Augustine and for governing there. The transfers, the official change in flag took place July 10th and July 17th. So this is the week of the anniversary, this week that we're in right now. And Jackson's actual principal acts as governor were to pass a series of ordinances which set up our first counties, Escambia and St. Johns County, set up the rules for city governments in St. Augustine and Pensacola, set up the county court system, and also set up the rules by which people living in Florida could become naturalized American citizens. Beyond that, he pushed very heavily to get his friends appointed into various posts in Florida because there were a whole series of new posts coming in the legislature and the courts. But President James Monroe largely rejected Jackson's recommendations. And once Jackson realized that he wasn't going to be able to lobby to get his friends into important positions, he quickly lost interest in being governor and in October resigned the post and went back to Tennessee. Probably the most important thing he did as governor, though, was become a very strong advocate for having a strong military and naval presence in Florida in order to protect the southern boundaries of the United States and to control the Gulf of Mexico. And just by way of conclusion now, one other thing that happened very early on in Florida, just a couple years into its time as a territorial period, was the establishment of Thompson's Island, later Key West, as a naval station. And to go back to what Sherry was saying early on, one of the reasons that naval station was established was to control and to confront piracy and other threats in the Caribbean, and to provide essentially a strong seaport and a strong naval base for protection of the Florida coast and the Gulf Coast. So again, Florida very early on emerges as a place which is key to future American security, both security at sea and security on land. And we're now going to finish just with a few observations about our two witnesses and what they perceived or experienced during the transfer.
So in conclusion, Jackson, Curtis, Ramage, and the Porpoise represented the incoming power and authority of the U.S. government that sought to reshape Florida in the image of the South. Nehemiah represented a population that was resisting the incoming power that threatened the indigenous way of life. And I need to add that after Jim talked about Nehemiah visiting Jackson, when Jackson and Nehemiah came to the Porpoise, as they were walking up towards the schooner, Jackson ordered Ramage to give a 13-gun salute. And as they were leaving the Porpoise, Jackson ordered Ramage to give another 13-gun salute, just to reinforce the authority and power of the United States. So the struggle between these two groups continued for decades, resulting in the ongoing conflicts that we know as the Second Seminole War and later the Third Seminole War. But I'd like to leave you with some thoughts from Curtis. This comes again on his observation in Pensacola. And again, I'm quoting, "On personal observation, we know but very little of the immense tract. But should the interior prove as no better than the land on the coast, we may safely venture to assert that it will never be peopled. And the only advantage we shall have gained by it is that it protects our seaboard from Maine to the Mississippi." We wonder what he would say today. Thank you. and we'd like to express our appreciation to all of the following.
Yes, as I said, we're very happy to have been able to address you today at the Joseph L. Brechner Speaker Series, and we appreciate Katie's help in bringing this about. And we should acknowledge that we've had a lot of support from Andrew Jackson's Hermitage during our research on Jackson, and the Florida Historical Society has been a big supporter and actually brought out the book on Jackson.
Well, thank
By
you
the way,
both.
it's on sale on their website. I might mention.
Yeah, thank you both so much for leading this talk for us. If you don't mind, we did get a couple questions through. So, and those who are listening, please, if you have any other questions, if anything else has occurred to you, please feel free. We do have some time, so please feel free to put those in the chat. So the first is just kind of a housekeeping thing. Someone asked if we can share the list of books that that you had recommended at the beginning. Do you guys think that it would be possible to send me the list of books that you talked about in the beginning?
We can certainly do that.
That list is not even close to being exhaustive. It was just to acknowledge that we're not reinventing the wheel and we're not trying to tread on the territory that very, very good scholars have done. But
Yeah.
I'll be glad to send you the part of the yes, for sure.
Yeah, that would be great. And then I can just send it out to our list of registrants for the program so that they can do some further reading if they're interested. And of course, in addition to both to you all's book. And then the question that we've received so far is regarding when the date is celebrated, I guess. So they ask, why is the July 10th, 1821 signing in St. Augustine looked over in place of the Pensacola event a week later?
I think both cities are celebrating. I know that St. Augustine held the commemoration yesterday, but they didn't. The change of flags did not happen on the same day. They tried to coordinate it, and Jackson frequently found that things in Pensacola were delayed. That was one of his great frustrations as governor, is that nothing ever happened as quickly as he wanted it to happen. And so Pensacola's change of flags actually took place a week after St. Augustine's. And we should mention that they were actually separate Spanish colonies. That's why there were two capitals. So they only became merged together under American rule. That's how we got the Panhandle, essentially. The Panhandle used to be West Florida, and then it became the Panhandle of the territory of Florida.
Excellent, thank you. So it looks like that is, we don't have any other questions. I don't know if anybody else is planning on putting a question in. I can go ahead and sort of start my outro comments here, I guess. And then if anything else comes through, then we can address them then. But I do want to just thank both James and Sherry for joining us for our talk today. I'd also like to thank everyone for attending today. We hope that you found the program informative and entertaining, and that you got something valuable out of it. We thank everybody. I see a lot of familiar names in our list that have been attending, if not all, several of these Brechner Series programs. And so we just greatly appreciate your continued support and your continued interest in what we're doing. I also do want to mention that we will be returning to in-person programming soon, but we are going to try and offer virtual options for those who are maybe not quite ready to make it down to the History Center yet. Or one thing that has been really valuable in offering virtual programming is we've been able to extend our reach. Not everybody that is viewing these programs is in Central Florida, and so it's actually been a really great way to extend our reach. And so we're excited to offer virtual opportunities as we can, of course. I do want to also mention that we have some great upcoming programming. So right now, our newest temporary exhibition, which is called Community, 5 Years After the Pulse Tragedy, is open and will run until August 15th. And on Saturday, August 7th, we're going to be hosting a final free admission day before the exhibitions close. So for this family-friendly event. We're happy to welcome several of our community partners to join us as we reflect on how our community came together in love and support following the Ponce tragedy. As we always do with these events, we'll be providing some activities and crafts and things to make it an event that the whole family is welcome at, and that there are things for the whole family. So the content of the exhibition is really about looking at the ways that our community came together in love and support following the incident. And so I think that it is something that there's will be appealing for the whole family in terms of the things that we're providing at the event. So I would encourage everybody to check out our events page for that and all of our other great upcoming programming. I'm just going to see if we have anything else. It looks like we don't have anything else. So just again, thank you so much, James and Sherry, for facilitating this for us. It was really great to see you both virtually in person. And it's a really great, fascinating topic. So I appreciate you closing out and helping us round out this series in such a great way.